Hey guys, welcome wherever you are, wherever you may be, and thank you for tuning in to this second episode of the Diving Deep edition of Pro Talk Outdoors. Back in episode 1 of Diving Deep, it was basically a nice long podcast to kind of get to know a little bit about Wyatt Rivers and who he is and what he stands for. And in episode 2 here, Wyatt and I, we took the show on the road and traveled down to the home of M.R. James. And this podcast is going to be an interview where we're going to dive deep in with M.R. and talk about several different things, the evolution of bow hunting, the history of bow hunting, talking a lot about the Pope and Young Club, and not just the history of bow hunting, but the present state of bow hunting and possibly into the future. Before we get started, though, with MR, I wanted to just kind of go over just a brief rundown of some of MR's accomplishments for those of you who do not know who he is. MR was the editor and founder of Bowhunter Magazine back in 1971. He was the editor of the first Pope and Young Record Club book back in 1975. He was a board member for more than 20 years of the Pope and Young Club. Was a past Pope and Young president from 2006 to 2010, and he was elected into the Archery Hall of Fame back in 2003, serving as the Hall of Fame president from 2009 to 2012. In addition to that, MR is an award-winning author, has written several columns. He's done several speaking engagements. He's a recipient of the Outdoor Writers Association of America Excellence in Craft Award, which is a lifetime achievement. That was awarded back in '99. MR has successfully bow hunted in 35 states and 7 Canadian provinces, collecting over 21 separate big game species in North America. And MR was kind enough, and his wife Janet, to invite us into their home and show us around. And MR's house it's almost like a museum or a cathedral of sorts to the history of bow hunting. And Wyatt and I were just kind of in awe while we were there. And again, we really have been kind of riding a high and enjoying that visit ever since we left. So without any further ado, I want to go ahead and get into the podcast. Here we are with M.R. James. Hey guys, thanks again for clicking on to episode 2 of Diving Deep edition here at Pro Talk Outdoors. And a little bit of a different sound today. And Wyatt and I made the trek down, hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes, something like that, to the home of M.R. James. And M.R. is gracious enough to invite us into his home, and we're really excited about having you on, MR. For folks that may not know exactly who you are and what you're about, can you give us just kind of a brief introduction of where you come from and what got you started?
Be happy to. I guess I'd start off by saying I'm a writer, first and foremost. I've always loved to write. I started writing magazine articles and selling them to national magazines when I was 19. I wrote fiction. I wrote murder mysteries and westerns for the old pulp fiction market. I also love to hunt, and it stood to reason, in my mind anyway, that if I'd go hunting and had a story to tell afterwards, I might as well write about it and try to sell it to a magazine. I sold my first hunting story, bow hunting story, to Archery Magazine in 1964 about a record book buck I killed here in Indiana in '63. And Roy Hoff, who was the editor of Archery Magazine, liked it, and he bought it, published it, and asked me to write more. And that's what got me really into writing for the bow and arrow market. I started in 1971. I started Bowhunter Magazine with the help of 3 friends. We lived in Fort Wayne at the time. We said that there seems to be a need for a magazine that's written for, by, and about bow hunters. And so we started a magazine on a shoestring budget. We all worked for the Magnavox company. 2 were engineers, 1 was a graphic artist, and I was a communications manager. And we all loved to hunt. And so we did a little talking to different bow clubs in Indiana. Went to talk to them and said what we had in mind, and they said, boy, that sounds like a pretty good idea. We'd be interested. So we said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start a magazine. We're going to start small. We all had good jobs at Magnavox, but we didn't have the money to really invest in a magazine printing or publishing company. So we said, we're going to, for 5 years, we're going to plow every penny that the magazine makes back into the business. And once it takes off, if it does, we'll talk about dropping out and pursuing it full time. We printed 15,000 copies of the first issue. The big newsstand distributions company weren't really interested because they said, how many magazines can you give us? And we said, we can give you 13,000. We had a press run of 15,000. We had a few people who subscribed sight unseen. They liked the idea. And so we said, we can give you 13,000. They said, give us 50 or 75,000 and we'll talk to you. Well, even back in those days,
it seemed like that'd be a heck of an undertaking there, especially getting off the ground floor.
That's exactly right. And, thinking about all those dollar signs, we said, what we're going to do is let us do this. We told this New York distribution company, let us tell you where to put the magazine. Don't put it in Indianapolis and the big cities, Cincinnati and St. Louis and Detroit. Put it in the farm communities. Put it out in the country where there's a lot of hunting and fishing. And trust us. They said, you won't sell 25% of the copies. I said, well, try it and see. We sold about 65% of that first run.
Well, that was kind of cutting edge, though, right? I mean, it was something that they hadn't really seen. A magazine focused on bow hunting, and they probably, I guess in their way of thinking business-wise, they were thinking that you have to put it where the big markets are in those big cities to get it to sell.
Well, that's right, but we were, call us mavericks or whatever, or just wanting to experiment, but we had a gut feeling that we knew where our readers were, and we proved it to them. Within 10 years, we started turning a profit right away, either subscriptions or advertising. But we plowed everything back into the business. At the end of, within 10 years, our circulation from that press run of 15,000, we were printing over 250,000 every other month. And we started within about 8 years, as I recall, we started making over $1 million in just advertising alone, not counting the subscriptions. And the magazine just really, really took off.
Talk a little bit, because I know we had a little bit of discussion before we started recording here about some advertisements that you had in the magazine in the beginning of your press runs, basically, and the evolution of the compound bow. I mean, you've been around to see it all.
Yeah. Alan invented the compound. He patented it in '67, and he couldn't get any bow manufacturers, any major companies, to make them.
Right.
So he made a few himself and sold them, but he was not. He was a ex-Navy veteran. He loved deer hunting, and the reason that he invented the compound, he told, was to get an arrow from the bow to the deer faster. He said, I'm sick of deer ducking my arrows. And so he wanted something that got faster. So he designed this god-awful looking contraption. I've got a picture of that thing. It weighed about 50 pounds, it looked like, and block and tackle. And I mean, it just was a god-awful looking thing.
That was my next question. Yeah.
But it did the job. And he kept experimenting. He'd cut down recurve bows and use a combination of pulleys and cables to propel the arrow out of the bow faster.
Right.
And he just was not a good businessman to speak of, and nor a marketer. But Tom Jennings out of California, he ran S&J archery out there, made custom recurves, and he took a look at that and said, oh boy, this is a good idea. And Tom was a marketer, and he was savvy with business and bow hunting and archery. And he took that thing, he got a patent from Allen and started making the Jennings bows.
Right.
And I shot both, and I'll put it this way. I in a magazine article I wrote about it, I said the Allen compound, the principle is great, but each time I shoot one, it reminds me of shooting a bow and hearing a garbage can lid fall, rattle, rattle, rattle. And a Jennings bow, when I shot it, was just quiet and fast, and in fact, one of the slogans was the fast one. And that's the whole principle. I killed my first deer with a compound in 1972 in Colorado. A little buck came out of a draw, started up the ridge toward me. I drew on him when he was about 60 yards away.
Right.
I'm shooting a 60-pound compound, and in those days, you know, you talk about 80% let off today.
That was my next question. What was the let off?
I think it was 12 or 15% let off.
15%.
So I'm holding this thing, but I'm holding it a lot longer than I could have held my recurve. And that buck walked up, and he got within about 15 yards, and he finally saw something he didn't like, and he turned broadside, and I shot him. And I'd held, I don't know, the time it took him to come out of that and walk up the hill. I was on him the whole time, and when he turned broadside, I shot him. And I couldn't have done that. And when I wrote the story about it, that's exactly what I said. And I also said, from a, producing the effect that I wanted, a quick, clean kill, it was great. But I said, a compound bow is still the ugliest bow ever designed. And it was, by comparison with a longbow or a stick bow.
Yeah, well, and it still is.
Yeah,
I mean, right? I mean, look at the craftsmanship and artwork that goes into making
That's
you
right.
know, recurve or a longbow, or they're beautiful. I mean, some of them are so pretty you don't even want to pick up and shoot. You know,
yeah, that's true.
I guess okay, here's another question for you then. So you shot that deer your first deer with a compound.
Mm-hmm.
What type of arrows were you using? What type of broadheads? Do you have like the weight or anything like that on like the broadhead? Like what was the weight of the broadhead?
I was shooting 125 grains because I was shooting basically bare razor heads.
Okay. Okay.
I also shot a broadhead called the Little Shaver, which was a two-blade head that you inserted an injector razor blade in for the cutting edge. So many problems that people had back in those days was getting a head sharp. Their razor head's easy to sharp. It's tough to keep it sharp. Black Diamond Delta, for example, is a great head, but it's awfully tough. And people would try and they couldn't do it, and then they'd go out and shoot something with it. They didn't get the results. An arrow kills strictly by hemorrhage, and you want to create massive hemorrhage. And unless that head is sharp, that deer could get away and die, or where you can't find him, or run around wounded for a while.
Right.
That's something you don't want. And then when Wasp came out with their injector razor broadhead, where they had as much as a 6-blade broadhead, but these things were razor blades that they were shooting, and they created tremendous, massive hemorrhage. But by the same token, you know that those old injector razors were kind of thin, and you hit a shoulder, you hit a bone, you hit something that slowed it down, they'd also snap off.
Right. Well, I mean, that can even, still to this day, I think that there's probably some of those problems going on between mechanical and fixed blade broadheads.
The thing about today's is the technology advanced to the point where it's a heck of a lot tougher. Yeah. Those heads. And I love shooting fixed blade heads, cut on contact points. But by the same token, a lot of people can't sharpen heads. So I encourage, pick something that's already sharpened that you can use, because your responsibility as a hunter is to make a quick, clean, humane kill.
Absolutely.
And you don't want that animal going off and leaving a spotty blood trail that you can't follow, and then you find him rotted 4 days later or something.
To that point, I think that there are a certain amount of people out there that say, I can shoot a mechanical because I don't have to paper tune my bow. I don't have to make sure that it's tuned properly and it'll fly. It'll hit the same as my field points.
Yeah.
Regardless, and I typically, the last few years, I've shot both. The last few years I've been shooting a fixed blade. Mostly because of the shoulder, some fear with that. And but even when I was shooting mechanical heads, my bow was properly tuned every time because, it's the most efficient, right? And I think that that's something that people can take away from this is just make sure that things are properly set up, and you do your due diligence to make sure, because we have a big responsibility out there, right? We're out there, we're trying to harvest some game and bring meat home, and it's not fair on our part to not take that extra time to do things properly.
Yeah, and I would say that back when I started, and most of the bow hunters that I knew, paper tuning, you didn't know what that was.
Right.
We just didn't do it. But we did shoot. And you can and should tune a recurve bow to match the arrows you're shooting. A lot of it you did not by shooting it through paper and seeing the cut, but by watching the arrow in flight. And if you got any kind of porpoising or fishtailing, something was wrong.
Yeah.
And so you'd adjust the string, or you'd, whatever. I put, always with my stick bows, I'd put brush buttons and some kind of string silencer on it.
And by adjusting your strings, you mean like kind of adjusting your brace height and things like that?
Yeah.
Checking to make sure that your arrow
we twist it a few
is...
turns, try it again, and shoot.
Right.
Until that arrow flew to the sight.
To where it wasn't... you weren't
watched the arrow, and again, when it went straight, looked like it went straight and hit, that was good. That was tuning a stick bow back in the day.
Right. Well, and you guys were practicing with your broadheads a lot of times too. You weren't doing that just with field tips. You were making sure that they were properly hitting at the same place every time. And that even goes for people that are shooting a compound in some regards. Make sure that you practice with your fixed or mechanical blades, whatever. Right. Don't just say, oh yeah, I'm shooting a mechanical, it'll shoot exactly the way that my field tip is, even if your bow is perfectly tuned.
Part of the problem today is when I used to buy, a dozen broadheads for $6, $8, $10. Now you've got a broadhead that costs you $45, and you're not apt to want to shoot that and test it. So that's why some of these companies are coming out with the dummy heads, the same weight. They just don't expand when they hit. But it's a good investment, and the best thing you can do is shoot the head that you're going to be hunting with, and that includes these fly open heads, these mechanical heads. Shoot to see, because there is a difference. And although they fly a lot like field points, there can be differences, and the thing you want to do is discover that when you're practicing, and not when that buck's standing out there and you shoot and hit him in the gut instead of where you were aiming in the chest.
To that point, we were talking earlier before the podcast started. You were saying that your effective range with the longbow and stuff now, or recurve, which you've been hunting with, around 20 yards, right? And that falls into somebody that's done this as long as you have. Wouldn't you say that it's probably most important for people to know their own personal distance as far with bow hunting? And not if you're comfortable shooting at 40 yards, then if a deer's at 45 yards, you don't need to shoot at that deer.
Yeah, the thing I've written, I don't know how many articles, and when I write books on bow hunting, I know your ESR. That's effective shooting range, because it's different. One of the problems people have today is they see these professionals. I know guys that can take a compound that's tuned, their bow, and they can hit a beer can consistently at 100 yards. Not 1 in 100 average people can do that. Not one. And yet they see him do it. They see he gets a big bull elk or a nice caribou or whatever. And so, by God, if he did it, I can do it. Well, you can't. And so, even when I shot a compound, and I used to shoot tournaments, I'm not a great shot, quite frankly, compared to the professionals. I mean, some of my best friends, they're Olympic gold medal archers who also hunt. They can outshoot me any day of the week with any bow out there. But I know what I can do. They know what they can do. And the thing of it is, even these people who are good, why do you want to shoot an animal at 100 yards when you're bow hunting?
Exactly.
Why don't you use woodsmanship? Why? The whole idea is getting close, remaining unseen, and delivering a killing shot. To just lob arrows at great distances and brag about it. Oh, I killed this deer on the run at 600 yards. Well, that's an exaggeration.
Well, and there's so many more arrows out there because it's not shooting at a beer can at 100 yards. You're shooting at a
flesh and blood animal.
Yeah,
and
they can move
and they duck and they do. You can have an elk feeding broadside. Elk's a big target, but it still takes a couple seconds, a lot of times at long range, for an arrow to get there. And that elk only has to take one step to make the difference between a double lung hit and a gut shot. And it's better to miss them entirely. But the people who are shooting these long distance, and one of the things that ticks me off personally, there's a lot of Western hunters who'll say, you got to shoot long distances. I lived in the West. I killed my first deer mule deer in 65. In Colorado, I was using a recurve Pearson bow. I shot him at just over 40 yards, probably 45 yards. I shot him through the heart. But I was shooting tournaments in those days, and it wasn't a long shot. I practiced, and I knew what I was doing. When I hunted with compounds out west, the furthest I can remember shooting a mule deer was probably 30 to 35 yards, because I worked in close enough. I took a shot that I was comfortable with. But you see a bull elk feeding out in the middle of a meadow, and you can't get any closer than 90 yards. Well, I'll take a shot. For me, I'll usually pass. I'll say, no, I'm not going to run the risk. I'll come back and maybe I'll sit up in this other neck of the timber in the morning, and maybe I'll get a closer shot.
Yeah, I mean, because really that's not ethical, really, to take that shot. I mean, at 90 yards, I mean, granted, some people may be accomplished enough to hit a beer can or, hit a target that at that distance, but, I mean, you're shooting at a live animal.
Yeah, and another thing that kind of torques me is some of these guys say, I never get excited.
Why are they hunting?
I'm saying to myself, my God, if I decide I'm going to kill a doe for meat, and I watch that doe coming in, and my heart's starting to pound, that's what hunting, the way I think hunting should be, is. You do get excited. You're shooting. You're trying to kill an animal. That animal doesn't want to die, and for you to just say, "Oh, yeah, it's no big deal," and I've been in situations where some guy will hit a deer. He'll say, "Yeah, I hit him. I know it was a bad hit, and I couldn't find the blood. And I'm going to go out and kill another one." I say, something's wrong. Look at what you did. That animal's out there. You didn't get him, and you're going out and you're going to try to shoot another one. Maybe you'll kill him this time, but maybe you won't. And if you get that attitude that, oh, heck, there's a lot of deer around, I can shoot. I don't care if I wound them. I've often said that unless, in my own case, let's use that as the example. In my own case, I've hit and lost deer, and it's torn me up that I lost them. I will not run the risk of, unless I can kill 95+% of everything I shoot at, I feel like I'm a failure out there. It's just, and the thing that I like about what I've seen over the years, a lot of the guides today are starting to say, if you hit an animal, if you draw blood and you don't get him,
You're done. Yeah, you're done, right.
Alaska, I think, does that with bears. Is that correct?
Well,
with certain, and maybe that's guided. I'm not sure.
Well, there's different rules for different.
Or
parts
British
of the
Columbia,
country.
maybe. Yeah.
Alaska does have some kind of rule, but it's the type of thing that you just do not. Humans, we're our own worst enemy at times, and we give anti-hunters the opportunity to point to other hunters who have lost animals and say, these guys are going around and they're wounding these animals and they don't seem to care, and look at this. This is terrible. And it is.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of bridges into a question I have for you. So concerning anti-hunters and non-hunters and hunters and, kind of everybody, how do you think that we can bridge the gap, especially like working with public lands? And I know that some of our western public lands are they're in danger of being taken away, or endangered of being inhabited by big oil and things like that. I know that a lot of anti-hunters are very pro national parks, national forests.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of hunters are very pro that. Is there a way for us to kind of bridge that gap between the two? Do you think can we ever get along enough?
You cannot get along with anti-hunters. I'm talking the rabid
right, the radical
anti-hunters.
Yeah.
I have debated. I've gotten my share of death threats. I've had arguments. I've been on television and radio with people who are saying how terrible hunters and hunting is. The thing that I come back to is a lot of these organizations, they're not interested in the animals. They're interested in putting hunters out of business. And the reason that I say is hunters, through the Pittman-Robertson Act and through giving everything we buy, every arrow, every broadhead, everything, certain faction of that, certain
goes to conservation.
Goes for conservation. Hunters are pro-conservation. The antis use their money to tell the world how bad hunters are. They don't benefit wildlife.
Right, they're not.
I tell them, go buy a damn license.
Exactly, and give back to the states.
You don't have to hunt, but that will help animals. You're not helping animals. Hunters are going to hunt. The antis hope that they can outlaw it.
Okay, so as hunters, what can we do, I guess, to lessen the fuel of the fire that we give to anti-hunters? Whether I think that social media has really kind of amped things up, right?
Oh yeah. Sure.
What can we do though? Like when we're on social media, when we're interacting with people. A lot of us have regular jobs and things like that. The majority of people that are listening here have regular jobs. Dave and I and the rest of the crew, we have regular jobs. We interact with people that are non-hunters or anti-hunters, from day to day, but especially the non-hunting public that maybe doesn't have an opinion. What can we do to, I guess, give a better perception of what hunting is to those people?
Well, you can, for one thing, we can police our own ranks. There are guys out there, I read things on the internet every day from so-called hunters that make me want to vomit. I see video clips. I saw one today, as a matter of fact, that turned me off. A guy taking a very long shot at a bear. I've probably killed 3 dozen bear in my career, and the furthest I've ever shot one was maybe 30 yards. Most of them were under 20 yards. A few were under 10 yards. And part of the whole idea is getting close. To me, that's what bow hunting's about. If you have to rely on your equipment as opposed to your skill at woodsmanship, think about what you're doing and what you're saying and what you're supporting. Because if I see some guy on, and I know I've honked some people off, but there are times when I would say, quite frankly, why did you post that video, or why did you tell that hunting story for other people to see? But around a campfire in hunting camp, you can have a beer and talk about the hunt, and you can say things and do things that don't really matter. But when you do that, and you've got people out there who parole, who patrol rather the internet looking for things to climb all over hunters about, you're doing damage to the sport. You're hurting me. You're hurting the people who are ethical and responsible. And it's these mindless jerks that talk about sticking animals and smoking animals. Like I said, I don't know how many hundred of deer I've killed, but I have never smoked one. I mean, I might have smoked some meat from time to time.
On the smoker, you know, when
but
you're going to eat
these guys, it just shows a lack of respect for the animal. Oh man, that same video, the guy shooting at the bear. Oh man, you smoked him. Oh, and using the F-bomb and just, you know, that sort of garbage. I'm and have been for a lot of years and good friend with Ted Nugent, and he and I agree to disagree. He throws around profanity.
He gets
all
pretty
the time.
excited.
Yeah, and he's as subtle as a kick in the groin. But you know, I respect him for his anti-drug, anti-alcohol stance in talking to young people. I also have heard him get on some people's case for saying and doing what I consider to be stupid things, and I'm talking other hunters. We don't do it the same way. I use the magazine. I don't swear that much. I mean, I'm not a saint at all. And Ted, that's his shtick. That's what he does, because he gets the crowd roaring and gets the people all worked up, and that's fine. But to go on the internet, and this one more thing I'll say about a lot of these celebrity hunters. When I was doing the videos back in the day when we started, it was a different world entirely.
Wait, can you give us an idea? When was this? Like what year?
I started hunting with Toxie Hayes and Cuz Strickland and the Mossy Oak people. I hunted with Bill Jordan. This was back in the 80s, the 90s, early 2000. Will Primos, hunted with Will quite a bit. Hunted with a lot of the guys that were having the best success with broadcasts on the outdoor channels. Bowhunter Magazine. We started doing. Let me say this real quick. When I started out and I was approached by these companies to have a camera and tag along, I said no thanks. I said hunting is a personal thing. It's between me and the animal, and I see too damn many shows on TV showing the arrows hit, showing the animal staggering around. When they started these videos and started, you were paying a professional videographer sometimes hundreds of dollars a day, and it was pricey to put these things out, and yet they didn't know when to shut the camera off. And you'd see these graphic scenes of animals running and, you know, blood gushing out of their nose and falling down and getting up and staggering, and the guy running up and shooting him again at point blank range. And, you know, the case in point, Fred Bear told me that when he shot that polar bear on national TV, on the old Sportsman, the deal with Kurt Gowdy, and I forget which network it was, but I used to watch it every Saturday, American Sportsman. He said that when that bear started spinning around biting at that, here's a snow white bear and you can see the blood spreading on its side, that was the end of hunting on network television, graphic hunting. You know, you shoot a bird and you see a bird fall out of the sky, that's one thing. But to see the graphics, see the blood. And he admitted that in his mind, he had caused the demise of the hunting shows on network television. The Outdoor Channel, when I started, they had gotten so much heat over some of these graphic kills that they wouldn't even show an arrow impact. I don't see anything wrong with an arrow impact as long as it's not overly graphic. And part of the thing was, when you invest a lot of money, you show everything. But this is where editing comes in. And you can very easily, instead of showing you shoot that animal again and show him staggering and going down, getting up and kicking and falling over again, and show him walking up to the dead animal afterwards.
Well, as a hunter, I mean, I've been in a situation before, where you've had similar things like that happen, maybe spine an animal or what have you, and that's not something I enjoy. So I don't know why anybody else wouldn't necessarily enjoy that. Now, it's something that happens.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the unfortunate part about hunting sometimes, that things don't always go 100% the way that you want it to go.
Exactly right. And one of the things too, I've had the opportunity to hunt with a lot of the name hunters, the big name hunters, and I like them. There's very few I've ever met who weren't good people and who didn't have the best interests of the animal at heart. But one quick case in point. Stan Potts is a very good friend, and we've hunted together in Illinois quite a bit. And just Brenda has been in our camp. Stan knows deer hunting. I mean, he's a heck of a deer hunter. The one thing that really torqued me with Stan, and he knows, we talked about it quite a bit, was when he killed that giant bear, that giant whitetail. It walked in and was standing, but it was facing him. And he was at full draw, and he finally said to the camera, "I'm going to shoot." And he did. He shot, and he hit him, and he hit him hard. But the animal didn't leave blood. And they looked for that thing for hours, and finally, by the grace of God, they located him. It was after dark, and I said, "You shouldn't have taken that shot." And he admitted, yeah, and to do it on network TV, or, well, it was a cable, but to do it on cable television where thousands of people see that, and they're saying, well, if Stan can do it,
I can do it,
I
right?
can do the same
Yeah.
thing. And he got it. He got it, yes, but they didn't see the hours of trailing. They didn't see the agony of wondering if he's going to get it.
And they probably didn't know the low percentage that actually presented with the hopes of recovery there.
Yeah, and that was one of my concerns. So Will Primos was the one that, well, it was he and Toxie from Mossy Oak. I told Will, I said, I'll let a cameraman come and watch me. And if I make a shot, oh, fine, get everything down, but I want to see how it's going to be used. Because I make bad hits. Everybody makes bad hits.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I would be lying if I said that, maybe I haven't taken a shot that looking back, I'm like, maybe I shouldn't have done that, But it worked out.
Yeah.
Right?
It works out sometimes, and other times it doesn't.
Right, but that stands to the point. If you're on TV, if you are maybe introducing a young hunter, if you're recording it in any capacity and showing other people, it's really important for us to try to do our very best.
It is.
And make sure that we're not taking those maybe chance shots or low percentage shots or whatever. And we should be doing that regardless if we're on TV or not, but especially if we're on TV, because we don't know who we could be influencing.
Well, and that's exactly right, Wyatt. You've got so many people out there who are looking for leadership and guidance. And it's great to see you posing with a nice buck or whatever afterwards. But again, to pose with him after you've gut shot him and not found him for a day or two, that's what's bad. Anyway, getting back to what I had said, I will let you do it, but I want to see it. We struck up that arrangement, and it worked out. It worked out very well. Didn't have any problems, and so I did it. But still, even when I was doing it for Bowhunter Magazine, I felt that this is still something between me and the animal. And sometimes, even after I made a perfect shot and he went down just in seconds, I still had that feeling that it's not violating the ethics of hunting, but it's like having sex in a sense. I'm not going to do a porn flick, and sometimes I feel dirty about some of the videos I see, that it's exposition. Again, real quick, we used to shoot. I mean, the cameraman's responsibility was showing, the hunt, walking in, getting in a tree, all this sort of thing. But you'd get the kill. That was the object of the hunt, get the kill, and then we'll make up the scenery. We'll do the outtakes. We'll do all this. In those early days, you shoot, and the camera stays right with. Today it seems like the first thing they do once that arrow hits, they switch to the hunter, and he's pumping his fist and he's yelling and dancing around, and it just, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how I reacted so many times, but when, and I'm not holding up myself as an example for God's sakes, but by the same token, the camera, when it came around to me, I don't know how many times I'd look up and say, "Thank you, Lord." That was something I said over and over.
Well, it's something that you felt, and that's what you would have said regardless if the camera's there or not.
Yeah, and when some of these camera guys would say, "Now we're going to react. We're going to draw. You draw the bow and you shoot," because they'll cut that in. They didn't get it.
A retake.
They'll come around and you come back, you shoot, and they say, "Now pretend you're watching the animal run off, and you see him go down," and that felt so hokey, and it was something that you think, "Oh my God." And yet I did it a few times, but I just got to the point where I said, "No, I'm not going to do it."
Didn't feel good about it.
I didn't. No, I didn't.
And I think going back to the point, what happened here?
Can you? Yeah.
Did I do something?
Nah, I don't know. We got a little bit of a sound. Oh, here we go. We're good now.
I messed with it apparently.
No,
sorry about that.
No. That goes back to the point you were talking about. The camera panning back to the hunter and showing their celebration, and that kind of goes to, I think, the way that hunting has transitioned in the last several years is it's glorifying the hunter and not glorifying the game that we're pursuing, and it's kind of sickening in some regards, because that animal's life that we're taking, that's what should be glorified. It's not that person that's doing it, because it could have been 10 other different people that could have been in that spot or what have you.
Well, I also, for years, have preached. I worked with Bill Wadsworth. I was on the board of directors, National Bowhunter Education Foundation, for years. Helped get the program started. Had Bill come here to Indiana to teach classes, that sort of thing. And one of the things that we did, and I did a video that they used in hunter training classes. That we went up to Michigan, up Peninsula, and did some field work and beautiful setups. And I mean, it wasn't hunting, but it was showing how hunters would practice correctly, how to do it right. It was a well done, well produced, very expensive video that they put together, and they used that thing for years. I looked like a kid in those days, and so I enjoy seeing it now and then and remembering when. But that's another thing. Education, setting a good example. If we don't do that, if we're not giving the generation that's now hunting the proper direction and guidance, and to watch these guys on TV who are, I'm not knocking their shooting, they're good shots, but to take a frontal shot at a caribou at 75 yards or 80 yards, when I shot instinctively and shot NFA tournaments, there was an 80-yard shot. But by the same token, you're shooting at a target, a paper target.
It's not going to move on you.
It's not going to move. And to shoot, and yeah, you can hit him and you can kill him. A lot of guys can. They practice at those yardages. But it's kind of ironic. I'll mention this real quick. I killed a deer one time with a 47-pound recurve bow at 65 yards. Well, 64 yards. I didn't know how far I shot. I saw him. He was out in a rye field feeding. I came around the corner of the woods, and I saw him, and he was broadside, had his head down, and was completely oblivious to me being there. I was shooting tournaments in those days. I looked, I said, okay, and shot, hit him right behind the shoulder. He went crashing off and died. And the fella asked me later, he said, how far was he? And I said, I don't know. But I have a habit. He ran off into the woods, so I took a piece of toilet paper out and I hung it on the bush right where I was standing. And then I paced out in the field where he'd been feeding, and I found the cut hair and the first blood, so I marked that. And after I'd looked around, I decided to go back to camp and get a buddy to help me get him. I paced it off, and it was 64 steps. And I thought, wow.
Long shot.
If I'd have known that, I probably wouldn't have shot.
Hey, folks, quick break here before we bring back part 2 with the interview with MR. Quick word from about some of our sponsors. I want to talk a little bit about Real World Wildlife Products. It's getting up here. We're talking about late April now, or getting really close to time to start thinking about putting those bean plots in. The Real World Wildlife Gen 2 soybean blend. So again, get out there, get those soil tests done, get them sent in. It's about time to start thinking about spraying the fields and getting that prep work done there. Also, want to talk a little bit about Glacier coolers. I just got a brand new cooler in the mail today. It's the Icebox 35 quart cooler. Really good looking cooler. It's a soft sided cooler. We have at this point in the season already, we've amongst Pro Talk Outdoors, we've harvested 6 turkeys already, and of those 6, I know of 4 of those turkeys have gotten to ride back home from a pretty good distance in a Glacier cooler. So, and they've done a fantastic job keeping the not only our drinks cold whenever we want cold drinks, but whenever we harvest a turkey, or even have had some fish that I caught in a Glacier cooler, and easy to clean out as well. So great coolers. Go to glaciercooler.com. When you're checking out, use the promo code PROTALK. Save yourself 20%. Also, Wicked Tree Gear. Fantastic product, especially now. You're getting into the time where you want to start, trimming up a little bit. If you're out there turkey hunting and you want to clip some limbs and, cut some limbs or clip some foliage back or anything like that, use those pruners, hand saws, do a fantastic job. Same thing with wickedtreegear.com. Go to the checkout, use the promo code PROTALK, save yourself 20% there as well. We're going to go ahead and get back to the second part of the interview with MR James, and we're going to discuss a little bit more about the history of bow hunting and the Pope and Young Club. So hope you sit back and enjoy this part 2 with MR James. All right, well, here we are. We got the computer lined out and took a nice little break. We're ready for part 2 here with MR James, and we spent the break kind of walking around, and I feel like a tour through a museum almost. There's a lot of history in this room that involves the sport of bow hunting, and we talked a lot about the Pope and Young Club, MR, and I'd like to ask you, talk a little bit about the history of the Pope and Young Club, and then also how you became involved with the Pope and Young Club.
Sure. Well, Dave, back in the 40s and 50s, bow hunting kind of struggled. There were a lot of people, particularly in fish and game departments, that didn't think bow and arrows were sufficient, capable really, of taking big game in a humane manner. And so we had to prove ourselves, really. And Glenn St. Charles, who was a Seattle bowyer and really activist who in the Northwest Territories worked with a number of different archery clubs and organizations to legalize hunting in those states, Washington, Oregon, California, that his goal was to create an organization that would do 2 things. One, prove that indeed bows and arrows were good for hunting big game, and 2, to preserve for all time, for posterity, the records of these magnificent big game animals. they followed a lead that the Boone and Crockett Club had set as far as scoring, how to score these animals, antlers, horns, and skulls. And they came up with a set of scores that if these animals are taken with a bow and arrow, they wanted them entered in the club. And you could enter them by submitting them to a panel or to a individual measurer, and they had volunteer measurers throughout the country. I became a measurer in 1978, which years after the organization was founded. It was founded in 1961. And Glenn was the first president, and he continued to be president for about 10 years. Larry Bamford, who was the hunting editor for Bowhunter Magazine, succeeded Glenn. And I first met Glenn St. Charles and Fred Bear and other people in the Pope and Young Club in 1972. And what they did was they gather once a year, every other year, for a awards banquet where they recognize the top animals taken during that recording period. And it's an every 2-year deal. I was fortunate enough to be editor of the first Pope and Young record book, which was published in 1975. I'd taken a lion, mountain lion, a black bear, and a white-tailed deer, all of which were in the record book. That didn't have anything to do with me being editor. I was also in 71 when we started Bowhunter Magazine, and I was an editor by trade. And since I didn't get anything for being an editor for the Pope and Young record book, I volunteered and had the opportunity to work with Glenn, Fred Bear, and the rest of the board of directors to put out this publication. And it took a lot of work and a lot of effort. But since then, since 1975, when that first record book came out, every 6 years they publish another one. And we have just published, I guess it was year before last, I forget what number it is, but in the succession from that first book, we've had every 6 years a record book published. The first record book had, as I recall, about 1,500 record entries. The last one had 100 and some thousand entries. All the top bow and arrow taken animals are listed in order by species. And there were 26, I believe, when the first book, and now there's 29. They've had like, for example, instead of just having a barren ground caribou, there's now a central barren ground caribou. The Thule elk is the most recent entry. It's an animal that's indigenous to California, maybe parts of Oregon, I don't recall. But by the same token, that has expanded too. Chuck Adams in 1970 completed what's called the Super Slam, taking all, at that time it was 26 or 27, I don't remember, species, every species that was recognized by Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young. And he was the first. Right now there's probably 30 to 40 individuals who have taken all the species.
That's one heck of an accomplishment to be able to do that. Emor, I'd like if you could, because this is something that Wyatt and I, as we were walking around, I feel like that even though we are very passionate about bow hunting and conservation, and we like to know more about the history of the sport, can you take a step back and talk a little bit about Saxton Pope and Art Young, and let people kind of know the history, the background, and the Ishi Indian. I'm probably saying that wrong. Was it Ishi? Was that a tribe, or was that just the Indian himself?
Ishi was a Yaha or Yahi Indian. It was a dying breed of Indians living in California, and the progress of civilization had essentially wiped them out. They were hunted, they were starved, they were driven from their homeland, and Ishi was the last survivor. In 1911, he came stumbling into a settlement called Oroville in California, and he was captured. He didn't resist, wasn't trying to fight. He just was taken.
He was probably happy to find somebody that
Probably
maybe could get
because
some
they
nourishment or
fed him
something.
and gave him some shelter. He was, as an Aborigine, an American, Native American, was taken to the University of California at San Francisco, where Dr. Saxon Pope was charged with studying him. And Ishi was questioned about his tribe, their rituals, their weaponry. Ishi in time showed Dr. Pope, and one of Dr. Pope's best friends was Arthur Young, who was a newspaperman in California. And he started, Ishi started showing them how to shoot a bow and arrow. Now, both Pope and Young were avid archers, and they already knew how to shoot, but he taught them the Indian way, the Yaha way of shooting and hunting. And they hunted together in California for a number of years now. Ishi only lived from the time he was captured in 1911 until 1916. He died of tuberculosis, a white man's disease. But during that time, he had shown both these guys how he hunted, and they in turn emulated him. They used his bow making and arrow making skills to improve their equipment, and they hunted in 1923, if I remember correctly. It was even before that. They went to Yellowstone Park in the early 1920s. They had permission to kill some grizzly bears for an exhibition display in the museum there at the university in San Francisco. And they went in with their bows and arrows and killed, I believe it was 4 grizzly bears with a bow. These animals, to my knowledge, are still on display. I could be wrong about that, but they were preserved for posterity. And Ishi and Pope and not Ishi was dead. Pope and Young took these animals. Art Young went to Alaska and produced what's probably the first bow hunting film, called Bow Hunting Adventures or Alaskan Adventures. The name escapes me right now. But it was a short, probably 20-minute film showing him take Alaskan brown bear, Dall sheep, moose, a variety of big game with his bow.
That's pretty amazing.
It was, and one of the people who saw this movie in 1926 in Detroit was a young auto worker named Fred Bear.
That's where I was hoping that would tie in there, and I'm glad that you brought Fred Bear up.
He was sitting in that theater, and he was seeing these big bears being arrowed, and this giant moose going down, and this Dall sheep being shot, and that fired Fred's imagination. And Fred made it a point to track down Arthur Young. Arthur Young, in addition to being a newspaperman, would go around with this movie and present seminars at different communities, speaking and answering questions. And Fred and Arthur got together, and they actually started shooting in tournaments together, and they became fast friends. And I should preface, going back to the late 1800s, there were 2 Civil War veterans who fought for the Confederacy, Will and Maurice Thompson. They were, after the war, they couldn't use pistols because they were firearms, rather. They were on the losing side. They couldn't use their big game rifles, so they had to start hunting. They lived in Georgia at the time, around the Okefenokee Swamp, and they used bows and arrows to hunt with. And the classic book, The Witchery of Archery, by Maurice Thompson, was a Bible that inspired Pope and Young, and Pope and Young in turn inspired Fred Bear, and Fred Bear in turn inspired millions of people. Will Thompson, Maurice, his brother, were tremendous archers. It was, I'm thinking, I get them mixed up. I wasn't alive to know them personally, so I'm going from faulty memory here. But in the 1902 Olympics in St. Louis, one of the Thompson brothers actually won a gold medal or a medal in Olympic archery. So I mean, all of this. Doug Easton, for example, was inspired. He was in California, and of course he started Easton Archery. Small shop became Easton Aluminum Company in Utah. It's kind of a snowball effect, and you can see how these pioneers, the Thompson brothers, there was another friend of Pope and Young was Will Chief Compton, who was raised by Sioux Indians and knew the art. He got with them, and he and Ishii and Pope and Young all hunted together. And it's just that kind of brotherhood that you can look back over the history of archery and see how it all interacted. It just snowballed. I mentioned to you during the break that there was a man in Wisconsin, Roy Case. Roy Case made broadheads. You didn't have all these manufactured broadheads. You made your own, but Roy started making broadheads for sale, and he made a broadhead called the Case Kiska head, and that broadhead sold. Roy made and sold broadheads from 1926 until 1954 roughly. He had a whole bunch of different broadhead designs, but he sold these to people who wanted to hunt with a bow and arrow. Roy Case is the man he gave us the term bow hunter for people who hunted with a bow, and his broadheads set the standard for all broadheads that have been produced in this country. In fact, the width of the broadhead that Case produced is still the width that is the minimum standard for broadheads today.
And that's 7/8 inch?
I said...
Not sure
You're
what
talking
it is.
to an old geezer whose mind is not as sharp as it once was. But yeah, it's that type of tie-in when you look back over history that just fascinates me. A lot of people today don't really care about the sport history, but it really matters when you get serious and you see all these connections and how it's grown over the years.
It's really been amazing to walk around and look in your room here, and you've got a picture over here of Roy Case. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Roy Case with the first actual whitetail taken by a quote-unquote bow hunter, and that was taken exactly 10 years prior to your birth. Is that right?
Yeah, I got to know Roy Case when I started bow hunter. He contacted me and wished me well and that sort of thing. Roy killed the first deer taken by a licensed bow hunter in the United States in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan on December 6, 1930. I was born in southern Illinois on December 6, 1940. And I've always felt there was some kind of connection that whether the gods, luck, fortune, whatever. I was born exactly a decade after the man who coined the term bow hunter came on the scene, and here I am 10 years later being born, and I've been known as a bow hunter practically my whole professional life.
And fast forward approximately, 31 years, and you, along with a couple of friends, create Bowhunter Magazine.
Yeah, in 1971, three of my friends, two engineers at Magnavox Company, and Steve Doucette, who was a graphic artist, Don Clark, Bob Schisler, Steve Doucette, and I founded Bowhunter Magazine. And it grew to be the largest and most successful bow hunting publication in the history of the sport.
And Wyatt, I want to shift gears here a little bit before we do. Wyatt, you got any other questions on the history of Pope and Young Club or anything? Well, one more question on the Pope and Young. Wyatt and I both asked you during the break. We have both harvested animals that would qualify for Pope and Young. However, we haven't entered those in the Pope and Young Club, and we asked you the question, why should we? You know, what's the because I think a lot of people maybe take a look at that and think it's kind of an ego boost thing or a contest. You know, I think a lot of people that are in a younger generation, they see Pope and Young Club not as the history and what it stands for, but they see it as, well, that's that 125-inch minimum, and it's just more of a scoring thing only and an ego boost.
Right.
So tell folks out there why they should enter any animal qualified into the Pope and Young record book.
Well, one of the things that I feel is important is people need to know that $35, which is the current entry fee for an animal, you have to pay a $35 entry fee to have your animal officially scored. That $35 is used in large part to go to promoting conservation and hunting in North America. The Pope and Young Club has a conservation officer, not a game warden, but someone who's in charge of promoting how the funds are used. And each year, $100, sometimes $200,000 or more goes to helping hunters have allies who fight the anti-hunters, who work with conservation departments in various parts of the country to bring back animals or to bolster herds to benefit all hunters. And so it's, I guess you could say it's an ego thing of sorts, because you get a certificate and it gives the official score, but you're not buying a certificate, you're buying people working on your behalf for the betterment of wildlife and wildlife conservation.
Well, and I think that that's been the misconception, you know, to some people, and I don't think that that's necessarily Pope and Young's fault. I think that that's, you know,
well, another
people misreading that.
That's right. And Wyatt, Dave, one other thing, and this is a personal opinion. You know, $35 is $35, and some people that's hefty. I had one fellow this year from Illinois brought me 4 deer to score in a single day, and they all made the record book. So, I mean, he wrote a nice check to Pope and Young. But beyond that, there are a number of people, and I've seen it as a scorer. I think I mentioned I've been an official measure of Pope and Young since 1976. And I've scored a lot of animals. Back in those days, it only cost $10, then $25, and now it's $35. But that money is used, I think, for a very good purpose. But you have individuals, and this is human nature too. I've seen it. Guys have brought me an animal, and they said, my taxidermist or my guide or my friend scored this animal, and it scores 187. And I look at it and I think,
no way that's getting to 187.
That won't score that. I had a fellow once, he drove all the way down from, I think it was South Bend. I lived in Fort Wayne at the time. Drove down, and he wanted his animal scored, and his taxidermist told him it was the biggest buck that anyone had brought in, and that year, and it was going to easily make Pope and Young, and you know, he thought it would score in the 160s, maybe even 170, which has been a Crockett caliber. And when the guy pulled in the drive, and I saw him get out, and he picked up the rack, it just wasn't mounted. It had the skull plate and the antlers, and he started up the walk. I took one look, and I thought, oh my God,
you're going to be a heartbreaker, right?
Well, I didn't have to be, because I welcomed him, and we shook hands, introduced, and I brought him in. And I've got a number of animals that I've taken hanging on walls in the house. He walked in the room where we're going to do the measuring, and he'd started looking at some of the animals on the wall. And he turned around and looked at me, and he held up the antlers, and he looked at the antlers, and he looked at some of the animals, and he said, maybe it's not as big as he said it was.
So he
wasn't upset, but I use that as an example only, that until it is officially scored, and this was the point I was trying to make, until it's officially scored. And we are particular. In skulls, it's 1/16 of an inch. In antlers and horns, it is 1/8 of an inch. And it has to be scored by someone like me, who is an official measure, to get the score to submit to Pope and Young. Now, let's say you kill a deer that is in excess of the current whitetail world record, which is 204 4/8 that Mel Johnson killed in 1965 outside Peoria, Illinois. That Johnson buck, the Beanfield buck, is a monster deer. In fact, when you stop and think about that, 1965, and it is still the biggest buck ever killed anywhere in the United States or in North America.
Yeah, and look what we're doing now. I mean, to try to grow bucks like that.
Well,
yeah. So I mean, that tells you.
It's still number one. But let's say you kill a buck that I score as 206, which is an inch plus over the world record. Is it a world record? No, because what happens? I send the form to Pope and Young. Pope and Young checks it, and they said, "Ooh, this is good. This is potential." They look at the pictures that I submit with it. Oh yeah, this is a big buck. But it will be, you will receive, as the hunter, you will receive an invitation to submit that deer for panel judging. That means that 3 guys or 6 guys total, like me, will measure it meticulously and go down to that 1/8 of an inch and see if it matches what I measured it as. And there's always, depending on how long it is, there may be a little additional drying, and maybe 1/8 of an inch or 2/8 of an inch. There could be some shrinkage. But these guys, these 6 professionals like me, volunteer rather, not professional. We don't do it for a living, but we're volunteer professionals in measuring. We will have to agree down to 1/8 of an inch on what it is, and that will determine if it's above that 204 4/8, it will be accepted. If it's not, it will be less and will get probably the #1 award for that recording period, but it won't be a world record. And when you read any story about some guy each season killing a new world record, that is bull. That is baloney. It is based on a score that has not been confirmed or verified, and that's true for both Pope and Young and Boone and Crockett.
Well, look at how many, just over the last few years you see pop up on Facebook or, wherever you're at, and it says, potential new world record, looks like this one's going to make, and it doesn't even come close. There was a kid a couple years ago in Iowa that shot, and this thing was a hammer. It was a big, big deer, but they were claiming that it was going to be the new archery world record and things like that. And it didn't even, by the time it dried and they did all the deductions and things like that, it didn't even come close to it.
Yeah, and I could cite instances in the past where there's been a, quote, world record, and people have seen it and they've measured it, and all at once the guy says, "I'm not going to enter it." And you think, uh-oh, and something isn't right. There have been, unfortunately, a couple of cases where people have entered an animal. Let's take cow's deer, for example, or coos deer is what a lot of people call them. They're a whitetail. They live in California, but a big cow's deer might score 90, 108, 110 inches, and then the world record might be more, 120 something. But by the same token, I could enter a cow's deer with one of the small Indiana bucks that I kill and call it, say I was hunting in Arizona, and I've got a new world record because it scores 135 or whatever. And there have been instances, and this is something a lot of people don't know as well. Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young are both aware of the fact that some people cheat. And so what we do, or has been done in certain occasions, is we will do a DNA test on that animal. We can tell what that animal ate, what that animal lived, if he'd had any kind of injections of these hormones that make antlers grow big, all this type of thing. And that is only because there are some people out there who will do anything for recognition. A world record whitetail rack might bring hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, lots of money.
Lots of money and notoriety and this sort of thing. And it's sad but true that some people will cheat.
I want to ask you this question, and feel free to not comment. I have no idea where you're at on this spectrum, but the Mitch, is it Rompola or Rompola? Rompola.
Mm-hmm.
Legit? Not legit? No opinion? I
well,
don't know.
no, I've gone on record and said what I think. This is something Mitch has. I think he was in his. He wasn't even a 10-year-old, if I remember right. It certainly wasn't 12 when he killed a state record in, I think it was Missouri, if I remember correctly. And Mitch killed this giant deer in Michigan. And people that saw the carcass, and I talked to individuals that examined it, said it's the real thing. It's not a fake. It's not. Mitch, and this is personal opinion, Mitch was a victim of his own making, so to speak, because first of all, he guaranteed that I would get to see the animal. Dan Bertalin, who worked as a writer and covered this, and this was really detailed in Deer and Deer Hunting. Dan Schmidt's the editor there, and he's a good friend of mine, and we kept tabs on what was going on. But I was promised by Dan that Mitch was going to bring this to an ATA show that January, and we would get to see it, and we would get to handle it, and we would. Well, that didn't happen, and it disappointed a lot of people. What happened in the meantime was Mitch got in some trouble with the law, and he was arrested, and either out of spite or whatever, he said he's not going to enter the animal. And I took that as probably the best thing that could happen to the sport, because although that might have answered the question, it was still something that, because of the crime, because of what had happened, it was not something that you'd want as the number one animal based on the situation. And that has been well documented, and but it was a problem that, again, Mitch created, and I certainly respect his ability as a hunter. He's killed some nice bucks and is a hell of a hunter, but by the same token, this situation was something that it probably is never going to be answered. This deal with the king buck is another situation that some people swear that Boone and Crockett, because of the way they handled it, just screwed this guy out of the recognition and whatnot.
Now, which one was the king buck? The one with the common base, or was that?
No, this was. I didn't follow the particulars.
Gotcha.
I really don't know. It was, as I recall, a gun kill, and so if that's the case, I wouldn't have paid any attention to it, because. But I'm aware of it, and I saw what social media has done and said, and it was a tremendous deer, but it was depending on how the interpretation of the score and some of the things that I would say that, in my opinion, Boone and Crockett probably didn't handle it as well as they should, and created a mess there too. But they stand by their decision, and that animal is not going to be a Boone and Crockett world record as far as I know.
Okay. Any more questions on that, Wyatt, on that subject at all, or?
No, I think I'm good. MR sure does dive in deep with stuff, so we like that, don't we?
Absolutely. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit, MR. You told us a story when we first came in upstairs, not long after we had arrived. We talked a little bit about where the whitetail herd is now versus where it was maybe back in the earlier years when you first started bow hunting. And if you could kind of walk through that a little bit and talk a little bit about hunting in the early '60s and kind of go from there.
Yeah, I started deer hunting with a bow in the early '60s. In fact, in 1961, I hunted all season and didn't see a deer. I did find a track or two, but that was indicative. I was hunting in Gibson County, primarily Gibson County, Indiana.
Right? Yeah.
In Indiana. And I also, when I was an Illinois resident, I hunted in Pope County with a friend of mine from high school. We'd go down there and hunt squirrels and scout for deer, and we hunted down there. And I took a first deer in Illinois with a bow. But in Indiana, it was after I got married in 1960. We were living in the southern part of the state here. I was wanting to see what I could do, so I started hunting some of the coal company property, some of the stripper pits, the overgrown stripper pits, the mining area. And there were a few deer around, but as I said, I didn't see a single deer in 1961. In '62, I saw one. I kicked a doe out of a bed in a honeysuckle thicket, and I thought, hey, this was the greatest thing I'd ever seen, a deer, a real live deer. In '63, I hunted pretty hard. I was in college, but I'd cut classes on Friday afternoon and make a 3-day weekend, 2.5-day weekend to hunt deer. And on the last day of bow season in '63, I killed what was my first Pope and Young buck. In fact, I shot him right before dark. He was rutting. He was with a doe. He was completely oblivious to me, and I was not much of a bow hunter in those days, but I got within 25 yards and he ignored me, and I shot him. And went back the next morning with a college friend, and we found him, and I thought, boy, he's pretty nice. He only had 6 points, but he had tremendous mass, decent length, and he was the first 6-point buck to make Pope and Young record book. And
that's pretty amazing, because it takes one heck of a deer to score 125.
Well, the thing of it is, in those days, the minimum score was 115, and he scored 118 something.
That's still a heck of a 6-pointer.
Well, it is. His circumferences at the base was, one side was just under 7 inches, and the other one was over 6.5. So you know that he's got some mass to him. And I kept thinking, oh, if he just had one more point on both sides, but he didn't. And he was the type of deer. He was an old deer. He was on the decline, but he was extra special to me, and I still count him. In fact, I'll show him to you when I go back upstairs. He was an extra special deer.
Isn't it amazing sometimes how maybe not the highest scoring deer or whatever, or turkey, whatever, you end up killing it. Sometimes it's those ones that don't score as high or that have such a big impact in your heart because of when you took them or, kind of the way things happen. Like that was your first big start, And I can remember the first deer I ever killed, and I killed it with a gun, and it was a button buck. But that was the first...
There's only one first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I can relive that hunt verbatim right here, And
well, I tell people, and that's still my standard. People say, "What's he going to score?" And I say, "I don't know, but if I shoot him, he's made my book, and that's all that's important."
Like that.
That's exactly the way I think we all should look at things.
But just. I'll add real quick. In all of the scoring that I've done over the years, I have had very few people ever, when they'd bring me an animal and it didn't qualify for the minimum, to be upset. They accepted it. They said, well, he's still special to me, and just because he doesn't make Pope and Young, that doesn't detract from how I feel about him. And I tip my hat to those guys.
Yeah, I think that's really encouraging to hear.
Yeah. I had one guy that brought me, he drove probably 2 hours in the rain. It was a storm, bring this deer down, and I scored him 3 times. And each time I got 124 and 6/8. He didn't quite, by
man.
2/8 of an inch, he didn't quite make the book. And I'm thinking, oh, and he said, hey, it is what it is. Just don't, it doesn't bother me. If he'd have made it, I've been tickled. I'm still tickled with him. I'm proud of him. And I just think that is the exact attitude to have.
It absolutely is. And I think that's anything else, Wyatt?
No, I don't think so.
MR, it's been an absolute pleasure to sit down here and kind of take a walk through the history of bow hunting. What, you got something else?
I do want to.
Okay.
I do want to add something. MR, I'd like to kind of weave this. Tell us your greatest bow hunting memory, or maybe your best bow hunting story.
That's a good one. Yeah, good idea.
They're all special. I have had the good Lord, for some reason, known only to Him, has blessed me. That first buck, I'll never forget that moment. That was and still is extra special. I was on hunt in the. People ask, what is my most memorable hunt? I was on hunt in the Northwest Territories. I took my son, who had never killed a caribou, his wife and my wife. Took a family vacation up there, went up in the middle of August to the Northwest Territories to a fishing hunting camp. We spent the first few days before the season opened fishing. The wives caught bigger fish than we did, but we were tickled that they had a ball. Dave on a second, or I think it was the second day, we were hunting together, and I shot a bull, and Dave saw me. He's been with me a couple of times when I kill my animal. He was with me when I killed a pronghorn in Wyoming, and he killed his first one the next day. Dave and I took a break for lunch, and the wives were along and our guides were along. We each had an Indian guide. I'll hurry this up if I can.
Oh, no, take your time. You're
and
good.
We were sitting there eating lunch, and we saw this bull coming, and I could kill 2 bulls legally. This bull started up the ridge that we were on, and we were in a bunch of rocks, and I saw where he was going, so I made a short stalk, and when he walked by, I shot him. And the girls got to see me shoot the bull, saw him go down, and the guide and I went over, and we took some pictures and then dressed him out, and we packed him back to the boat. We'd left the boat. We were about 1.5 miles across the lake from camp, and we were probably 2 miles by foot inland where we shot him. So we packed this meat and cape back to the boat, and Dave, in the meantime, was going to go ahead and hunt. By the time we got back, Dave had killed his first bull. I didn't get to see it, but here's this nice bull. He was tickled to death. I was tickled to death. The wives were happy. We were happy. And then something happened that it still boggles my mind. Leon was Dave's guide. Ray was my guide. And they were taking care of Dave's bull. When we got back, they were getting ready to, or Leon was getting ready, and Ray helped, and they started skinning the bull. And my daughter-in-law, Norma, was videoing the thing, and I was standing there taking some still pictures of them field dressing it. And Ray turned around and was working on, I don't know, maybe we'd taken the head off and he was starting to cape the rack. I don't recall, but he was doing something, and Leon was finishing dressing. And I had just turned my back, and Leon was working the knife blade down the inner leg, the back, and he came to the joint, and he was pulling. And I heard him say, "Oh," and I looked back around, and he had rammed the knife in his thigh just below his crotch, and each time he was wearing white pater pants, and each time his heart beat, there was about a 6-inch spurt of blood going out, and we knew he'd cut the femoral artery.
Oh my.
And we're 2-3 miles from camp. We're 90 miles from Yellowknife and the nearest hospital. And you've cut a major artery. I'd killed an elk in New Mexico that same year, and I cut the femoral artery on that 800-pound animal. and he was down and dead in just minutes. And we kind of looked at each other. I ended up grabbing my backpack, and I pulled out a cord, some twine, cut a strip, used my knife as kind of a lever, and tightened it to shut off the blood flow. Made an improvised tourniquet. We got Ray on the radio to call base and explain what happened. To make a long story short, a float plane had just dropped off supplies at our camp and was on the way to another hunting camp, and they heard our emergency call. They said, "We'll turn around, we're coming right back." There was a Kennecott diamond mining operation about 90 miles north, and they heard it, and they called and said, "We have a helicopter here. We'll send it down if that will help." And we said, "Please." And so the wheels started turning, and we got the bleeding stopped. We covered Leon with coats to keep him warm. We gave him water to drink, and the girls kept talking to him. He told them about his family. He had several kids, and we're thinking, oh my God, there's no way we could pack. He was a big kid. He probably weighed 200 plus pounds, and trying to pack him across that uneven tundra, there was just out of the question. And we knew, and I think he did too, he's probably going to die. To make, again, to shorten things, the Kennecott helicopter, we saw it go by, but they didn't know where we were, and they had to fly to camp to get directions. And then here it came, and they were able to land on the tundra within probably 20 yards of us. Dave and I picked up Leon. I had him under the arms, and Dave had him by the legs, and we carried him to the helicopter, and by the time we got him in the back seat, there were rubber floor mats on the floor, and there was blood completely covering that. His leg was soaked in blood because just moving him that far opened it again. We got the tourniquet secured again. Norma and I flew back across the lake in the helicopter. There was that float plane had landed, come back and landed, and we loaded Leon in the float plane. Norma got in with him. I stayed. And they flew off to Yellowknife, and I think everyone there thought that it was going to be the last time we'd see Leon alive, because he had lost so much blood, and it was just one of those scary things. Well, Leon passed out right as the plane was landing, and there was an ambulance waiting. They rushed him to the Yellowknife Hospital, and the surgeons were able to reconnect the artery and saved his life. And so we stopped to see Leon on the way back before we left, and he was pretty quiet. When Norma was filming him and asked, "How many caribou have you cleaned, Leon?" he just said, "Lots." And he was a man of very few words, but when we came to see him that last time, he'd smile, and he just said, "Thanks." And that meant so much. And later that year, I get the mail one day. We're in Montana. Open this envelope box from the Northwest Territories, and inside is his guide badge. And he had put a thank you note in that and sent that, "Thanks for saving my life." And that was a memorable hunt, my most memorable.
Wow, that's quite amazing. And I mean, I don't even know what to say. That's just a great hunt, and then even a better ending because you were able to save somebody's life. Just amazing.
Yeah. Well, the good Lord was looking over all of us that day.
Without a doubt. Wyatt?
I'd just like to say thanks to MR for taking the time to talk to a couple regular guys about bow hunting, and his wife Janet for letting us in his house. I mean, we came to MR's house. He didn't just do this over the phone. I mean, that really says a lot, I think, about the type of person that he is and the stance that he has on bow hunting and the willingness he has to get on any platform, whether that be big or small, to stand up and speak highly of bow hunting and for hunters. And I think that, we all owe him some thanks for what he's done for the sport.
I would absolutely second that, MR. And before we let you go, I know you've got a page out there, an internet page or some social media sites. Can you tell everybody where they can go to get your tips and kind of follow what you're doing?
Yeah, I've got a Facebook authors page. It's Mr. James author, and you can find me there. I've also got a personal page where I post a lot of daily events. That whitetail that 10-point buck I was chasing on the farm here all last season, I documented daily with pictures. I found out it was a lot easier to hit him with my camera than it was with an arrow. I was hunting with a friend of mine who'd passed away. I was hunting with his recurve, and I was only going to take a 20-yard shot. And I had that buck so close so many times, but never gave me the opportunity to make a good killing shot, and so I didn't shoot him. I'm going to be turkey hunting with that same bow next week when the season opens here. And I'll be hunting that buck or another one this fall on the farm, because I told his family that I was going to shoot something with that bow in memory of Chuck, and that's what I'm going to do. But as I say, the good Lord has blessed me, and I have had an amazing number of experiences that have meant the world to me. And I just hope that some of the stories I've shared with people over the years have meant something to them, because they're the ones that have made all this possible, either through buying the magazine or buying my books. And I can honestly say that I've been blessed.
MR, thank you so much for allowing us to come into your home and speak with you on this. And I'm sure we'll stay in touch.
You bet. Hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey guys, we're going to sign off. This has been Diving Deep, Pro Talk Outdoors.